What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. So at the time that I'm recording this video right now, I just finished watching The Flash, and God, it was an amazing episode. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, although the video is probably going to be going up today. FYI, I actually record my videos about a week before you guys see them, and sometimes I'll upload them and make them unlisted, and then people will just be like, oh, a secret video! Like, they'll find it, and they'll be super excited, which, by the way, I've actually got a video on my channel. No one's found it yet, and I'm curious to see whether or not you guys can find it, but I have a video up on my channel that's been up for a month, and no one knows that it's there. Like, it's kind of funny. I was just testing to see how it is that you guys find my secret videos, and it's kind of weird. But anyway, so after reading the free comic book day version, or I guess really the free comic book day release of Captain America Secret Empire, what I wanted to do is I really want to kind of go back a little bit, because with Secret Empire, I mean, you really could just pick up with All New, All Different Marvel, just kind of start with the Avengers and then read, like, you know, Avengers Volume 1, and then like Captain America Sam Wilson Volume 1, then Avengers Standoff, and then Captain America Steve Rogers. You could go in that order and read those stories, but in truth, I think it all really kind of dates back to Rick Remender's run. And the reason why I'm doing this is because of the fact that for those of you guys who are new to Captain America, you know, like Hydra Captain America is the first time you've picked him up, I want you guys to be able to have a sort of foundation. I want you guys to be able to look and to see why there are so many people who are up in arms about Captain America. And I feel like Rick Remender's run that starts really with Steve Rogers being trapped in Dimension Z and then coming back and then fighting Iron Nail and then losing the supersoldier serum and getting old, I think a lot of those things really kind of encapsulate what makes Captain America what he is. So for the next 3 weeks or so, we're going to run through all that stuff. It'll be like every other day or something like that. I mean, we're back to alternating All New, All Different Marvel and DC Rebirth every other day of the week. So it'll come pretty fast. Like, I mean, we'll roll through it within a week and a half. But initially, this kind of picks up with the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1926, and it picks up with the early days of Captain America. Now, a lot of people have really redone Captain America's origin in a lot of ways. For example, Captain America White was an amazing story by Jeff Loeb. I keep forgetting. It was an amazing story by Jeff Loeb, and it was really, really good to kind of take a look at Captain America. I mean, you know, Tim Sale's art was, you know, really cool and everything, but the fact remains here that with Captain America's origin kind of being revamped, so to speak, here by Rick Remender, what it does is it gives us a basis behind why he is the way he is. And over the years, this has been done in different ways. I mean, different people have done it in different forms, but the common theme among the traditional Captain America that you think of is that he is a guy who stands up for those that can't stand up for himself. And again, while the origin's kind of been redone and not a lot of people know the specifics about what he was before he became Captain America, it was always just kind of taken as that's what he is. That's what he's about. He's a guy that stands up for the weak. What we end up getting here is we end up basically finding out that his father, you know, growing up in the Great Depression, was a very abusive man. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say that he's like every other man during the Great Depression. I don't know enough about individual personalities during that era to make that claim. But what I can say is the father of Steve Rogers was probably one of several people out there, you know, just having common sense, that would tell us that he basically lashed out at those of us around him. Because keep in mind, during the Great Depression, and especially around that era, the man was the breadwinner. I mean, this was really kind of long before World War II. It was long before women were able to step into the age of having jobs in the workplace and running companies and so on and so forth. And so for the father of Steve Rogers, it was a pride thing. It was the sense that he just wasn't really able to make the kind of money that he needed in order to provide for his family adequately. Now, on the surface, it seems like an admirable thing, but it's not. And the reason why is because in his anger and in his irritation and his frustration with his lot in life, he turns to alcohol and he abuses his wife. Now, Steve Rogers, you know, basically kind of watches a lot of these things unfold. And we're not really given an indication here, at least initially by Rick Remender, that Steve Rogers' father takes his hands to Steve himself. But his mother keeps standing up, keeps basically getting back up again and refuses to fall down. Now, this is not Rick Remender saying, oh yeah, you know, feminism and so on. It's not like that. What it is it's giving Rogers the foundation, because he asks his mother, why didn't you just stay down? And she replies, because you always stand back up. No matter what happens, you always stand on your feet. That is the core of what makes Captain America what he is. And people who are fans of the traditional Captain America are probably like heartened by that little bit of a description. They're probably kind of heartened by that. Like, yes, that is Captain America. He is the guy that always stands back up. He will fight until the bitter end. Now, of course, this kind of transitions to the modern day when he's just fighting some guy called Green Skull, and he's literally just like a crazy environmentalist guy. He just wants to detonate some kind of bomb on Earth or, you know, in Manhattan that'll, like, you know, hyper evolve plants and turn people people into plants and weird. It's weird, it's nonsensical. This isn't designed to be some great big huge story arc thing. It's designed to be pretty base. I mean, the guy's defeated pretty quickly, he's handed over to the cops, and that's the end of that. Steve Rogers goes to meet Sharon Carter. Now, a little bit of an exposition here. Sharon Carter's kind of had a weird history over the course of Marvel Comics. There was a point where she was the daughter of Peggy Carter, and then she was the niece of Peggy Carter, and a lot of that kind of stuff was basically changed up because of the chronology of Peggy herself. But the fact remains here that with Peggy Carter having been the love interest of Captain America during World War II, and the fact that it just wasn't plausible, it wasn't practical to have the two of them together, let's say 60 years later or something like that, when, in the modern day, it made more sense to pair Steve Rogers off with Sharon Carter. So the two of them have been a couple for quite some time, and really their relationship has kind of evolved to the point where they're talking about the idea of marriage. Now, for Steve Rogers, and really what Rick Remender does here is he basically provides this circumstance where Steve's just kind of like, I don't know. And it's really kind of cool because he plays on the hero archetype of Steve Rogers. He really kind of gives us this idea that Rogers doesn't really know how to be a regular person. In World War II, because you got to think about it from his perspective. He grew up with an abusive father, so he had this intrinsic drive to protect those that couldn't protect themselves. That became a reality when he became Captain America. He fought in World War II, he fought alongside the invaders, he was frozen in ice for some 20 years, he was thawed out, he joined the Avengers, and all he's done is fight as a superhero since. He's never been able to sit down and kind of, let his hair down, so to speak, and just be a normal human being. It's always been one adventure after the next. The Earth is in danger, New York is in danger, the universe is in danger. There's always been something going on that requires him to be a superhero. And so when presented with the opportunity to just be a man, it's almost scary. It's almost just kind of like exploring this new part of himself that he's never really had a chance to explore before. Now, all this doesn't really matter anyway because of the fact that when he gets on the subway train, he's just kind of whisked away to Dimension Z. Now, we're not really told how, we're just kind of told that he is. And in truth, it's just sort of it's a transition piece. It doesn't need to be super in-depth, but his arrival is met with Armin Zola. He's basically kind of knocked out, he's subdued, and he wakes up in a lab. Now, something to point out here is that Armin Zola being here in Dimension Z is just a byproduct of the landscape of Marvel Comics after House of M, which is to say a lot of the characters were just kind of revamped and they were adjusted and they were kind of given new stories and different things like that. And so Arnim Zola was just kind of vacant for something like 8 years, and then eventually he showed up here. But with regards to him having a robot body, this was actually fleshed out. I mean, it had been established in Marvel for quite some time, but it was basically fleshed out in Invaders Now, written by Christos Gage and drawn by Alex Ross. It's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful story. But what it does is it focuses on the invaders during World War II. Like we said, Captain America, Bucky Barnes, Jim Hammond, and Name of the Submariner. But the idea was that, in World War II, Arnim Zola was just a guy. He was just a crazy scientist guy. But eventually his physical body was destroyed and he basically kept his own mind intact in the form of a robot. And that's just how he functioned for years and years and years. It was a way for Marvel to just kind of keep his character going with him staying a villain without having the supersoldier serum and just kind of keeping him alive. Because after a while, if he didn't have the supersoldier serum or the Infinity Serum, which is what Nick Fury had in order to keep himself young, Arnim Zola would just grow old and eventually die. And so just for the sake of practicality, he was just kind of given a robot body. But the fact remains here that we also end up finding out that that Arnim Zola is basically growing a child in an incubation tank. Now, this is a young boy that he's basically kind of growing into his own for the purpose of absorbing or taking the supersoldier serum out of Captain America and putting it in this child. Of course, Captain America is able to free himself and he takes this boy along with him. But we also end up learning that Arnim Zola also has a young girl named Jet Black. Now, in truth, these are not children that he had biologically produced with any particular woman. They're basically grown. They're engineered by Arnim Zola, as is everything within Dimension Z, Dimension Zola. All this stuff belongs to him. The ships, the aliens, the whole 9 yards. Now, a lot of them were created and then just kind of set out in the environment, and they were more or less just left there. But the idea is that in the midst of the explosion, Zola cannot find the child, cannot find his son. And so his initial thought is Captain America basically killed him in the explosion. But of course, as we know, Captain America took the boy with him. And so for those of you guys who are reading a little bit about Captain America, about him having a son, that's where this comes from. It comes from the whole Dimension Z, when he basically rescues the child or takes the child from Zola. Now, the reason for this is just Steve Rogers kind of being a reasonable human being, in the sense that if Zola has a child under his control, it hits it home for Steve Rogers. Zola is a bad guy, and he will basically turn this child into a villain for all intents and purposes. And so because of that, Rogers is both serving as kind of a guardian of this child and a surrogate father, in the sense that he names him Ian, and he even goes as far as to say that for the year that they've been there, because we actually jump forward by about a year, the year that they've been there, they're learning new things all the time. Steve Rogers is basically learning about this entire place. He's learning that, you have to be a really successful hunter. You have to learn to be able to fend off on your own. But the issue with this is that this basically contradicts directly with his desire to return home, because every waking dream that he has, every nightmare that he has, is always about the idea of getting back home to Sharon Carter. The problem with this is that within his chest, he has this constant nagging pain. Now, this is going to be kind of a recurring theme. This nagging, burning sensation in his hand is going to be an ongoing theme that happens with regards to him, trying to cope with what's going on. But for the most part, things are pretty straightforward in the sense that he and his son are just trying to navigate throughout the different territories of Dimension Z. And they come across different races. They come across different groups. For example, they end up coming across a group that calls themselves the Frox. Now, the Frox are just one of the various species that exist in Dimension Z that serve the purpose of just kind of opposing Arnim Zola. Now, they do not launch like campaigns against Zola just because of the fact that, with regards to Zola's, sphere of influence and the capital city and so on and so forth, they just don't have the abilities to fend off against it. But what Rick Remender's doing here is he's basically saying, this is just one of those circumstances where we've stumbled across a race that's just kind of grown unto itself. And that's really what Zola did. Zola would basically, he was like a prime mover. He would create these species, he would set their evolution in motion, and then whatever happened, happened. But again, they were just kind of designed in a way to where he could monitor them to a degree, but he could also just kind of rule over a land of his own. Now, in the end, Zola's goal is to also basically take over Earth. I mean, to invade the Earth with his forces, so on and so forth. But we end up finding that there's actually some trouble in paradise here. There's some strife among the ruling class of the Frox in the sense that their existing leader is really more of a tyrant than he's led his people to believe. But it's also this idea that he's kind of giving in to the existing rule of Zola, which is to say that he's not really leading a revolution. Now, of course, Steve Rogers is able to activate a universal translator that was previously given to him by Hank Pym and is able to understand what it is that they're saying. And this is where we end up finding there's kind of a debate between the various members of the Frox in the sense that some of them view Steve Rogers as a liberator, as a guy that opposes Arnim Zola and can in turn help them be liberated from Arnim Zola. Others view him as a guy who sides with Zola and is more of a spy. Now, ultimately, those that view Rogers in a positive light end up coming out on top, and the end result is that he actually takes up residence with him to being by the name of Zofjor and his wife. And the result is that he's kind of taught, how to survive, he's taught how to fish, taught the tools or the skills that he needs in order to make it in Dimension Z. But ultimately, this leads directly to a conflict between Zofjor and some of the other species when Steve Rogers chimes in and says, look, if you don't like Zola, then rise up against him. Now, ultimately, the response is that nobody else wants to fight against Zola just because of the forces that he has and so on and so forth. But ultimately, what ends up taking place here is Rogers says, look, all it takes is one guy, again, kind of hearkening back to the lesson that his mother taught him. If you live on your knees, you're going to be forced to exist on your knees. You're going to be forced to serve other people. But if you stand up and you die fighting, then maybe you'll become a martyr for something else. Now, this brings in a lot of philosophical ideas about the nature of conflict, right? I mean, right now in Secret Empire, Captain America is the tyrant. Steve Rogers, as an agent of Hydra, is the bad guy. Now, we'll cross that bridge in terms of retcons and so on once we get to Avengers Standoff. But for the time being, it brings in a lot of these philosophical arguments. For example, people will say, well, martyrs win wars. Well, not really, because they're dead. Wars are won by the people who fight long enough to win the war. It creates this kind of funny situation. But then again, what motivation would they have to fight if they weren't led by a martyr, if they weren't inspired by the actions of a martyr? So it's really kind of like all these different themes come together to lead to a conflict as we know it. But again, this agony in his chest, this searing pain in his chest that he experiences time and time again once he basically makes his escape is revealed to be Arnim Zola, who planted himself inside the body of Steve Rogers. Now again, this is kind of weird because this is what Zola does. Zola will basically jump from one host body to the next in order to keep himself alive. Now, he still has his physical body. I mean, he still has that robotic body, but keeping himself alive in Steve Rogers will allow him to defeat Steve Rogers. And the reason why is because of the fact that fighting Captain America is not just a physical battle. I mean, it is in a lot of different ways. If you're super strong, Captain America is not going to be able to face off against you. The Incredible Hulk versus Steve Rogers in a legit fight, Rogers is going to lose every single time. It doesn't matter what his tactical experience is, but when it comes to facing off against Captain America, somebody like Arnim Zola uses psychological advantage. And that's what it is. Basically, we end up picking up 11 years after this revelation. Again, Rick Remender kind of jumps us forward, and we end up finding out that with Arnim Zola inside the body of Steve Rogers, he constantly talks to him. He constantly taunts him. Now, the reason why this is significant is because of the fact that Arnim Zola, as he exists in Steve Rogers, is more or less equivalent to the techno-organic virus. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, in Marvel Comics, the techno-organic virus is basically a virus that converts organic tissue into machinery. It's what's attached to Cable. It's what makes Cable half of a robot. He uses his telekinetic and telepathic powers to constantly keep the virus at bay. That's why he's not as powerful as he could be. That's why Strife is so much more powerful than Cable, because Strife is basically Cable cloned without the techno-organic virus. So he's everything Cable could be. But the fact remains here that within the realm of this particular story, Arnim Zola is basically a virus constantly trying to take over the body of Captain America. The difference here is that Captain America doesn't really have a tried and true way of suppressing Arnim Zola, with the exception of whatever healing factor his super soldier serum offers, and maybe whatever kind of, mental control he can exert over his body, if any at all. And so because of that, Zola's just slowly taking over the body of Steve Rogers. But along the way, what he's trying to do is he's coming to grips with the fact that he might die. Now, of course, he knows that if he gets back home, if he gets back to the main Marvel universe, that he'll be able to go with the Avengers and they'll be able to remove Zola and the day will be saved. But on the off chance that he doesn't make it, on the off chance that he ends up dying, he's passing all these important lessons on to Ian and doing the best he can, basically telling them, you have to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. You have to work for those who are basically trying to save themselves, who are trying to become a better person. Your role is to be a hero and to be a leader instead of a conqueror. Now, of course, this also coincides with Arnim Zola basically talking to Rogers about the true heritage of Ian. And the reason why is because Ian has grown up believing that Steve Rogers is his father. And whenever the question was asked, where did I come from? Where's my mother? Rogers would always dodge the question. He would always divert Ian's attention to something else. And as a child, as a pretty young kid, Ian never really had a reason to ask any questions. But now he's in his teenage years. And the result is that he's a little more angsty. He's a little more rebellious. He wants answers to the questions that he's been asking, but have been denied him for so long. And so because of that, ultimately we have Arnim Zola kind of speaking out on behalf of Steve Rogers, essentially saying, you were grown in a lab. You are a kid who was basically just kind of created. You don't really belong to Steve Rogers. You're not his biological son. You're just kind of there. Now, of course, this is crushing for Ian. And this is actually going to be one of the reasons why Ian effectively defects from Steve Rogers, which leads into the second half, which is Escape from Dimension Z. But the fact remains here that we also end up picking up with Jet Black. Now, again, Jet Black is basically the daughter of Arnim Zola, as we saw earlier in the story. The problem here is that Rick Remender does not really expand much on her character in terms of what she's capable of. All we know is that by virtue of the trials that she had experienced, which are basically the lessons she learns engaging in different combat scenarios, honing her skills, she has what are called omnisenses. Now, the idea here is that she can basically transform any one of her 5 senses into omnisense. So, or I guess elevate it to omnisense, meaning elevate it to the height of its abilities. So if she wanted to elevate her sense of smell to its highest point, she literally takes away from all the other senses. So she diminishes all 4 other senses down to 0 so that her sense of smell can be at its peak. But she also has like enhanced strength and different things like that. But again, a lot of these things aren't really given to us. She's simply just an adult now and has these different powers, and that's really about it. Now, she's also a prodigious fighter. She can also see slightly into the future, and so she knows the moves that people are going to make before they make them. Now, of course, this also leads directly into her motivation in the sense that she, like Arnim Zola, believe that their son is dead. And so remember, Arnim Zola inside Steve Rogers is a totally different being than Arnim Zola the robot. They do not communicate, they do not talk, they have no way of knowing the other one's there. So the best example I can give is like from Harry Potter, right? Voldemort. One of the Horcruxes, the Diary of Tom Riddle, was able to act totally separate in and of itself, but Voldemort didn't know about it. He couldn't talk to it. He wasn't telepathically aware of what was going on. It was just a totally separate entity. So again, it's really kind of that's the best example that I can think of off the top of my head, spur of the moment. But the fact remains here that ultimately we end up finding the Frocks leading somewhat of a revolt, but not by choice. What we end up finding out is that Arnim Zola basically sent his forces out across the landscape to find Captain America. Now again, this is basically him alongside Jet Black going out to get revenge on Captain America, because in their mind, Captain America led to the death of Arnim Zola's son and Jet Black's brother. And so because of that, the fight is relatively short-lived in the sense that we end up seeing them, kind of hold their own. But the other half of this is that Captain America inspired a lot of these members of the Frocks to basically fight as best they can. And so while Captain America and Ian jump into the fray, Steve Rogers comes into direct conflict with Jet Black. Now, this is when we get that little bit of an explanation by Rick Remender in terms of what she's capable of. But again, it's really only situational. It's not super complex. It's not super in-depth. It's only really this scenario where Steve Rogers doesn't understand why she's so fast. He doesn't understand why she's able to predict his moves before he makes them. But that's really it. I mean, there's not a whole lot doing here. The ability for Steve Rogers to make his getaway comes into play when we end up having Ian making his presence known. And Ian basically showing himself to Jet Black means that as far as she's aware now, he's very much alive. And so what ends up happening here is Captain America uses the opportunity to basically grab Ian and get out of there. Now, of course, this comes after the conflict between Arnim Zola and Captain America himself. But again, basically making his escape, kind of stumbling away. The last action that he takes here, the fact that he has this little Arnim Zola inside his body, the last action that he takes here is to basically grab a knife to essentially gut himself and cut this thing directly out of his insides. And so it's kind of gruesome, it's kind of screwed up, but this shows us how ruthless Captain America can be when it comes to really achieving his goal. But it also shows us how dark Dimension Z is, that he's really kind of being forced to revert to some pretty base instincts, to some pretty base forms. It's just meant to show us that Steve Rogers is doing what it takes in order to get out of Dimension Z proper. Okay, so as we pick up with the second half of the Dimension Z story, for those of you guys who are curious as to why it is that Sharon Carter is old in All New, All Different Marvel, this explains that. And that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to cover this, is because it's the little tidbits that sort of kick off with this story that end up leading us into understanding all the different facets of what's going on with All New, All Different Captain America Steve Rogers. Now, of course, again, we'll get to the whole Hydra stuff and all that once we cover Avengers Standoff, and we'll offer more of an explanation, or at least a more in context based explanation once we get to that particular story. It'll make a lot more sense once we get there. But the fact remains, following the conflict between Jet Black and Steve Rogers, what ends up happening here is Jet very much finds herself romantically interested in Steve. That's one of the crazy things that's offered here. What we're basically told is that with the upbringing that she received from her father, Arnim Zola, he kept her very isolated away from any possibility of romantic interest with other people around her. Now, a lot of this was done because of the fact that in the eyes of Arnim Zola, romance is inherently a distraction in the sense that it'll get in the way of actual motivations. And so because of that, in order to make sure that Jet Black functioned at her peak capacity, there could be no distractions. There could be no romantic interest or anything like that. And indeed, that's how she reached the level that she's at right now, is by not having any romance with anybody. Now, in truth, a lot of that was because of the fact that the creatures that surrounded her were just grotesque as hell. And so there was no chance of her ever falling in love with those things in the first place. But the fact remains here that with Steve Rogers, his combat prowess, the fluid nature of his movements, the fact that he fights with his heart and soul is intriguing to Jet because he's as much of a warrior as she is. So it's kind of like this romance forged in the fires of battle kind of situation. It's a little screwed up, but it's also a little romantic to a degree. You know, it's one of those weird little things, but the fact remains, Steve is very much on a mission to regain Ian from the clutches of Arnim Zola. The problem with this is that Arnim is basically going to work on Ian. He's going to work for the purpose of trying to sway Ian to his side. Now, the way this initially kicks off is that Arnim basically beseeches Ian and says, hey, look, I'm your actual father. I need you very, very much. Now, in truth, Arnim is just being very manipulative. That's all it is. He's just manipulating his son for the purpose of bringing him back under his control. Now, the reason for that is because of the fact that, remember, Arnim Zola basically plays mind games with the heroes that he goes against, specifically with Steve Rogers, because they've been enemies for quite so long. With regards to how Arnim Zola views Captain America, I would say he views him, or he really knows him as well as almost anybody in Steve Rogers' personal life, after seeing how he fights and seeing the things he cares about and so on and so forth. And so by taking control of his son, he can in turn take control of Steve Rogers. Now, this is very Nazi oriented, and that was the nature of Arnim Zola back in the day. You know, a lot of those campaigns when he existed under the Nazis before he eventually defected and went over to Hydra, it was this whole idea that with the Hitler Youth, for example, you control the parents by controlling the kids. And so by basically taking over the son of Captain America, he can sway Ian to his side and then use Ian as a way to defeat Captain America. And that's exactly what happens. Now, what he does is he basically uses brainwashing. He subjects Ian to non-stop images of Captain America fighting. But what he does is he says Ian is not the first child that Captain America has taken and used for his own purposes. Of course, he points to Bucky Barnes. Now, the funny thing about this is that Rick Remender's kind of bringing in Ed Brubaker's retcons as well as the public perception of Bucky Barnes. And what I mean is that in the old Captain America comics from the 1940s, you know, going into the late 1940s, really kind of the early 1950s, Bucky Barnes was just the traditional sidekick kid. He was the hero, or the sidekick who stumbled across Captain America, changing into his uniform and was like, I won't tell anybody your secret if you make me your sidekick. And the two of them fought alongside forever, and then, you know, they were both kind of captured. The idea of Ed Brubaker's retcons came into play in the sense that where we believed previously that Bucky Barnes had just died in the explosion of Baron Zemo's, you know, drone plane, that Bucky Barnes had actually been taken by the Russians and turned into the Winter Soldier. But prior to that, Bucky Barnes was not just some kid on a military base that came across Steve Rogers changing into his Captain America uniform. Instead, Bucky Barnes had been trained in espionage, had been trained in stealth, had been trained in torture and all different kinds of military tactics that would allow him to gain the information that he needed. Because Captain America was not willing to torture, because he wasn't willing to kill, Bucky Barnes Barnes was assigned to him in order to serve as part of the invaders. But the public perception was that Bucky Barnes was just the sidekick. And that's what Arnim Zola grabs. He grabs the public perception and then broadcasts it to Ian and says, everybody thought that Bucky Barnes was a sidekick, but he was just a kid that Captain America just took and made a sidekick of his own. Again, manipulating Ian, tricking Ian into believing certain things. Now, of course, this also coincides with Captain America arriving, to confront Jet Black. Now, of course, this is where Jet's loyalties begin to be torn, where Ian officially is brainwashed, where he's inducted into the views of Arnim Zola and basically becomes his henchman. Jet Black goes the opposite way. She begins to side with Captain America. And the reason why is because of the fact that he basically tells her, look at everything that's going on around you. Open your eyes. Like, Arnim Zola's a bad guy. He's enslaving races that he's created. He's torturing them for information. He wants to conquer all of reality and invade Earth. He is a bad guy. You have to see him for what he is. And when you do, then you'll know what road to take, what path to choose. Now, eventually, she makes this decision when Steve Rogers saves the life of one of the innocent frocks that have been taken by Arnim Zola for the purpose of trying to create a new race of soldiers, trying to evolve them and make a new race of super soldiers. And so because of the bravery demonstrated by Captain America here, Jet Black ultimately sways to his side and basically betrays her father to a degree. But remember, her loyalties are torn. She's torn between her father, the man who raised her, despite the failings that he has, and Captain America, who she's in love with. And so again, it's really kind of cool to see them going back and forth, to see them kind of mishing and mashing. But ultimately, where Steve Rogers begins the process of making his way to Arnim Zola to basically conquer him, while Jet Black makes her way towards freeing all the other frocks that have been taken prisoner, we end up having Ian jump into the fray and shooting Captain America. Now again, this is going to be kind of cool because this is Steve Rogers trying to get his son back to his side, and on the surface, Ian does not initially join him. Ian basically says, look, my name is Leopold. It's not Ian. At the same time, we also end up finding out that this entire Citadel, this base of operations, is basically just an interdimensional craft that will allow Arnim Zola to move from this Dimension Z into the main Marvel Universe and begin the process of conquering Earth after amassing all these different, creatures that he's created as a massive army of sorts. And so again, what ends up happening here is that while Jet Black is able to free a lot of these members of the Frocks, Steve Rogers is able to finally sway his son to his side. Now, the cool thing about this, about what Rick Remender's doing with this bit of a story, is it's basically kind of harkening back to Bucky Barnes, right? I mean, for years and years and years, Steve Rogers just believed Bucky Barnes was dead. Brubaker brought that back and said, no, Bucky Barnes was alive, but he was being kept in stasis between missions by the Russian KGB to carry out assassinations on behalf of the Russian government. And so because of that, when Steve Rogers finally came to the realization that Bucky Barnes was very much alive, what it ultimately meant was that Steve Rogers could now bring Bucky Barnes back to sanity. Now, of course, what this did is it basically left Marvel with the ability to create some really, really cool stories with Bucky, where he just kind of went forward knowing his memories as the Winter Soldier and having his memories as a sidekick of Captain America and kind of finding his own way in the Marvel Universe, eventually becoming the man on the wall. But the fact remains here that this is that scenario for Steve Rogers, compounded by the fact that he views Ian as his son. He doesn't view Ian as his adopted son. He doesn't view Ian as his surrogate son. He views Ian as his son. And that's kind of the cool thing here. This is Rick Remender bringing in the concept of like parents who adopt kids, right? There are parents out there who adopt kids and that's their child. It's no one else's child. That's their child. And they raise that child as their own. They teach that child everything they believe to be right and wrong. That child might as well be theirs in terms of a biological sense. It's not, but it might as well be because they're just as good as their biological child. With Captain America, it's the same way. He views Ian as his son. He raised that child from infancy up to where he is right now. And so he's not just fighting a foe. He's not just fighting Bucky Barnes as the Winter Soldier and then using the Cosmic Cube, to help him kind of jumpstart his memories. What it is it's him trying to bring his son back. And ultimately, in this moment of beseeching his son, when he says, I love you, Ian begins to sort of snap out of it. Ian begins to wake up and basically realizes that Captain America really does care about him and view him as a son. Unfortunately, none of it matters because of the fact that Sharon Carter shoots him in the neck. She shoots him in the neck, and it is wild. It really kind of came out of nowhere. Now, Sharon Carter being here was initially just kind of like, what? How in the world does she get here? Well, Rick Remender is nothing if not a guy who knows how to tell a damn good story. And so because of this, what we end up finding out throughout the entirety of his time here, time as it passes in Dimension Z is much faster than as it passes in the main Marvel universe. Now, in truth, this is really just Rick Remender giving himself a way out, but we really kind of knew that was going to have to be the case, right? Like, you couldn't write a story about Captain America trapped in Dimension Z, he escapes, and then 20 years have passed in the real world. Honestly, that just wouldn't work. We would have had to know, there would have had to be some kind of MacGuffin, right? Like a cosmic cube would have to be used, or he would have to time travel, or any number of other things would have to be invoked in order to set things back to rights. But what Sharon Carter says is, look, as soon as you took off on that subway train and things seemed wrong, I followed you. What ended up happening is that while you believe that, a decade has passed, 15 years or something like that have passed, in truth, only 30 minutes have passed in the main Marvel universe. So it's almost like he was gone for the blink of an eye, half an hour, and she's caught up with him. Now, again, this allows Marvel to kind of bring Captain America out of Dimension Z as if no time had passed at all and keep the existing continuity intact. Because remember, this is all really just kind of leading up to the collapse of the multiverse. It's all leading up to Secret Wars, and it's leading up to Captain America losing the super soldier serum in his battle with Iron Nail and Sam Wilson taking up the mantle. And so because of this, it's a multifaceted conflict on different sides against Arnim Zola. You have Jet Black freeing the different Frocks and then going against Arnim Zola, raising an army against him. At the same time, you also have Sharon Carter and Steve Rogers going against Arnim Zola proper. Now, ultimately, Sharon Carter's able to pull this off, but only in the sense that she basically has to detonate the entirety of Arnim Zola's dimensional ship, or whatever it is, in order to basically pull off his defeat. The issue here, though, is that in the process, Captain America and Jet Black are able to make their escape back to the main Marvel universe, but in the process, Sharon Carter is believed to have been caught in the explosion and basically left behind. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that, again, for those of you guys who are going to be getting in, or I guess for those of you guys who are picking up with Captain America Steve Rogers from All New, All Different Marvel, Sharon Carter's old because of the fact that she's been stuck in Dimension Z all this time. Now, the reason why Captain America didn't age is because he's got the super soldier serum. He'll stay young no matter where he is. He could be in a dimension where time travels 500 times faster than it does in the main Marvel universe, and he will age accordingly. I mean, he'll still get older, but he won't age by 500 years. He'll age by a fraction of that. Okay, so we officially are going to begin. I guess this is really more of a prelude than anything else, but this gets us into the territory of the Iron Nail, which is a guy by the name of Rand Shin, I think it is. He was a guy created by Rick Remender, but is basically the villain that's responsible for stripping Captain America of his super soldier serum. And it's really cool because he's basically the reason Steve Rogers becomes an old man. And it's really, really interesting. It kind of set the stage for All New, All Different Marvel, different things like that. But for those of you guys who read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, Infinity, that kind of stuff, this is the reason why that happened. Now, something else that I want to point out here, and this is something that I haven't really brought up to this point, if you were to go through and you were to look up like Avengers and New Avengers, you were to look up like the prelude to Secret Wars, you wanted to look up the events that led into the collapse of the multiverse and so on and so forth, you would read through Avengers and New Avengers, and then suddenly you would pick up a story called 8 Months Later. What 8 Months Later was designed to do was basically follow up all these individual stories, because remember, Marvel still had a ton of stories going on for individual characters and teams when the events of Secret Wars suddenly kicked off. You basically had Last Days and so on and so forth. And so what that meant is between the trade 8 months later and the story before it, all this stuff with Captain America took place. All the things with Black Widow and with the Incredible Hulk and all that kind of stuff, all that took place. And so it'll be kind of interesting because what we'll actually do is when we get to our Marvel cosmology, we'll roll Captain America into, that playlist, and we'll actually stick it right between these two things, 8 months later and the story that came before it. So you guys will be able to see it in chronological order, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out. But again, Rick Remender is amazing when it comes to how it is that he writes Steve Rogers. And what's so funny about this is you can see the Rick Remender, or I guess, yeah, you can really see the inspiration from Rick Remender in the writing of Nick Spencer with regards to All New, All Different Captain America and, with regards to Secret Empire and all that kind of good stuff. Because what we end up having here is basically Steve Rogers after the events of Dimension Z, when he had basically spent 12 years inside of this other dimension where time passed faster, only to find out that once he got back in the main Marvel universe, only 30 minutes had passed. And so he experienced 12 years of living. He experienced what it was like to basically take a child who was being raised by a despot inspo, and then make that child a superhero, more or less. Teach Ian everything he knew about what it meant to stand up to do the right thing. But all of these lessons that Steve Rogers passed on to his adopted son came by way of the lessons that were passed on to him from his mother. And that's the coolest thing, is because what Rick Remender gives us are these really touching final moments. And it's really cool because as she tells him these lessons, as she teaches him these things, we also get this sort of overrun where he's basically going through surgery to get rid of the last little tidbits of Arnim Zola that are stuck inside of his body. Of course, a lot of this work is being done by Bruce Banner and Hank Pym. It's so cool to see this because his mother says Steve Rogers has been through so much, and he has. I mean, as a child, he lived through the Great Depression. He saw what it was to live in abject poverty. He experienced a father who abused his mother, and right now he's basically seeing his mother dying. And so because of that, she basically says, look, the road that you've taken, the path that life has put you on, has the ability to send you in two different directions. You are coming up on a fork in the road. When the time comes that I leave this world, you will be at a fork, and you can go left and become a horrible human being. The world is terrible. The world's bad. Just become this really cynical person that's just filled with anger and negativity. Or you can go right and become every bit of the man that I know you are. You can become optimistic. And she passes these things on to him. She says, people are optimistic. People try to do the right thing. If given the choice between right and wrong, people will do right. But the funny thing about this is we could also kind of attribute this to like an archaic method of thinking, right? A cynical person would say, no, that's how things used to be, but people don't think like that anymore, and they don't talk like that anymore. But then again, that's just a reflection of what it is that we happen to see or what we choose to see. With regards to what it is that his mother's saying here, in their heart of hearts, when it comes down to it, when you strip past all the layers, when you get past all the struggle and strife, people are inherently good. And she says, no matter what happens to you, no matter what roads, what events that you see after this, you always have to do the right thing. You always have to be the right guy. You have to make the decisions that you think are best. You have to fight on behalf of what you think is right. But these are very general terms. These are very general ideas. Do the right thing. Fight for the right cause. Stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. But this is all just a reflection of Captain America as we traditionally see him. And, to kind of bring in Secret Empire for a second, because this is really all kind of leading up to that, so I think we can have this bit of a discussion. Bringing in Secret Empire for a second, that's what makes this so cool. And that's what makes Secret Empire so cool, is because we think of Captain America and he does the right thing. He always fights the good fight. He stands up for people that can't help themselves, all the while championing the American flag. What if he did all those things, but instead of an American flag, he had a Hydra flag? Well, then suddenly it changes everything, because now he's not fighting for American ideals, he's fighting for Hydra ideals. And Hydra ideals are different from American ideals, but it's also a reflection of society. And that's really what Nick Spencer is doing with Secret Empire. He's basically criticizing modern society. He's criticizing how things function at the moment. Within the realm of Marvel Comics, Secret Empire was just the most logical outcome of the events that have transpired so far. I mean, with Captain America being a Hydra agent and looking around and just kind of biding his time, waiting for a chance to take over the world, he wakes up one morning only to find out that Thanos had decided to invade the planet Earth. Why? Because of the fact that he's trying to wipe out all of his offspring across the universe, and one of them just happens to be on Earth. This leads to a war with the Inhumans. Black Bolt absolutely freaks out in a state of panic, detonates the Terrigen bomb, which begins spreading the myths all across the planet Earth. These myths just happen to be deadly to mutants, and when the mutants ask the Inhumans to stop, the Inhumans say no because our numbers are growing. It would be like us asking you to stop having mutants that are born, to simply eliminate mutants in their entirety. This leads to a war between the Inhumans and the mutants, but during this time, an Inhuman is suddenly born that has the ability to supposedly see into the future. Carol Danvers takes it as an absolute truth. This leads to a conflict between her and Tony Stark, setting off the Second Civil War. All the while, Captain America is just watching the events unfold and watching the superhero community become more and more fractured. The Avengers are going in. They're fighting various villains. There's collateral damage. People are completely displaced when their homes are destroyed, and the Avengers just leave, allowing Damage Control Incorporated to take over. Kamala Khan and Miles Morales and a handful of others get tired of seeing that, so they branch off from the Avengers. They form their own faction called the Champions. Captain America looks around and sees the superhero community, society itself, is more and more fractured. Sam Wilson is the new Captain America, and people don't like it because it's different from what they're used to. And as a result, humanity within the realm of the Marvel Universe starts tweeting out things like #NotMyCaptain. If society itself became as fractured as it did over something as nonsensical as who it is that's wearing Captain America's shield, if superheroes can't get along, if they're waging war against one another, if Captain America sits down and says, society is inherently broken and I, as Captain America, am a protector of society, then the only option I have here is to protect society from Serum itself. And that ultimately leads to him stepping in, initiating all these different plans, becoming director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and dominating the entirety of the United States, setting his sights on the rest of the world. It's an amazing series of events that all led up to this singular instance of Captain America ruling everything. Now, of course, again, this all really predates that, kind of getting back into this story a little bit because we kind of got off on a bit of a tangent. This predates all that. This is still the Captain America that you guys know and love when you think of Steve Rogers. But the cool thing here is that this all really just kind of leads to that final moment. It leads to that grandiose scenario of Captain America being appointed as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and gaining absolute power over the US military, taking control of the United States during the events of Secret Empire #0. Now, what we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna jump back a little bit to 1968. And the reason why is because we're actually going to join a guy by the name of Ran Shen. Now, Ran Shen is effectively a guy who was formerly a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. And that's kind of the crazy thing here, is because of the fact that we end up seeing him just sort of approaching this dragon that looks an awful lot like Fin Fang Foom. But the result here is that a bargain is more or less struck. Now, we're not given a whole lot of information about this dragon. All we're really told here is that this thing basically has the ability to imbue Shen with some measure of power. We don't know what that means. We don't really know what it makes him capable of, at least not right off the bat. What we do instead is we actually end up jumping forward a little bit to 1969 by about a year. And we basically have Shen being held captive by Dum Dum Dugan and Nick Fury. Now, this is when we learned most of the backstory about his character, that he was basically one of the absolute best S.H.I.E.L.D. agents that were out there. But he was assigned the task of infiltrating communist China during its rise to power and seeing if there was basically a way to topple Chairman Mao. But what this ended up doing is it basically led to Shen becoming corrupted by the power that he possessed as he rose through the ranks, eventually being ousted by Chairman Mao himself, which led to Shen encountering this dragon in the first place. And so what this does is it basically shows us this is how Nick Fury and this is how Dum Dum Dugan lose their Infinity Serum. Now, this is something that's interesting because not a lot of people know about this. The Infinity Serum is what it is that allowed Nick Fury to stay so young for such a length of time. This, of course, all really kind of goes back into the idea of Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. Back in the 1960s, when Marvel first introduced Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos, they were basically just a World War II team. But the cool thing is that their history delved into a lot of different things. For example, they were tasked with finding Dr. Abraham Erskine and bringing him to the United States. Abraham Erskine, of course, being the man who was responsible for making Steve Rogers into Captain America. So again, Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos had a lot of hands in a lot of different events that had taken place over the course of Marvel Comics. But along the way, they had discovered an infinity formula that, if ingested, would basically slow the aging process. And I don't remember exactly what the ratio is, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll say, 10, or I guess 1 for every 10. So for every 10 years that pass, they only ever age by like 1 year. That's just kind of throwing a random number out there. I don't think we're ever actually given an exact number, but it gives you an idea of how slow they age. But the fact remains that in the middle of this interrogation process, Ran Shen basically attacks Nick Fury and Dum Dum Dugan and strips them of their infinity formula. Now, this is basically Rick Remender setting up the events of the conflict between Ran Shen and Captain America himself, where Ran Shen's basically going by the name the Iron Nail and ends up stripping Steve Rogers of his super soldier serum. But again, it's a really, really cool bit of storytelling here. And the reason why is because of the fact that after redonning one of his S.H.I.E.L.D. outfits, Shen is basically tracked down by Bucky Barnes. Now, Bucky Barnes had been assigned to basically kill Shen just by virtue of his role as part of the Winter Soldier under the control of the Russians. And it was a different set of events that was taking place in Bitter March. But the idea here is that this also coincides with a point in time when Nick Fury did not know who Bucky Barnes is. And so again, for those of you guys who read Ed Brubaker's run that saw the return of Bucky Barnes to Marvel Comics, when Nick Fury was the one who was giving Steve Rogers all this information on the Winter Soldier, the idea that it might be Bucky Barnes, this series of events right here is what set the stage for Nick Fury to launch that investigation in the first place, eventually leading up to Ed Brubaker's run and the revelation that Bucky Barnes was still alive, at least as far as Captain America knew. So again, a lot of history is being made in this little bit of a story. A lot of information is kind of being thrown at us. And so it's really kind of cool to see how all the dots connect and how it all really just kind of comes together. But one of the last little tidbits that we end up picking up here is the concept of Weapon Minus. Now, we have a video that I've already made on a history of Weapon X, of Weapons Plus, all that kind of stuff. So you guys can basically check that video out. You'll find it down in the description. But Weapon Minus was basically S.H.I.E.L.D.'s response to Weapons Plus, the program that basically set the stage for the introduction of Wolverine, Wade Wilson becoming Deadpool. Weapons Plus was basically the one that set all that stuff up, Phantom X and all that kind of kind of good stuff. But the fact remains that behind this door is actually a guy by the name of Dr. Mindbubble, and we'll learn a little bit more about him later on in terms of the role that he plays here. But at this point, we actually kind of jump back to the modern day, and what we end up finding out is between the time that that Shin escaped and adopted the mantle of Iron Nail up into the modern day, he's essentially operating out of the Great Wall of China. And what he's doing is he's going through to all the wealthiest people around China and basically taking them prisoner and forcing them to work in camps for the purpose of allowing him to find mines or go through all the mines, all that kind of stuff, whatever resources happen to be there in addition to his own plans. But in truth, this is Rick Remender actually showing us a pretty interesting situation. On the surface, we would look at Iron Nail and say, he's a bad guy. He's doing bad things. Is he really? Because those individuals who basically made their money by using the working class for their own ends and then disposing of them when they were of no more use, he's actually not the worst person ever. At least some individuals would say that. Not only that, it's also Rick Remender kind of poking fun at this idea of money and how very, how worthless it is. For example, these guys that are being brought here are billionaires. They're people with so much money, but for all the money that they have, what good does it do them? They're still working in these caves just like everybody else. They're being made to work to the point that they die just like everybody else. Where's their billions of dollars? Where's their cars? Where's their houses? How is any of that going to protect them? When it all came down to it, who they were as people was the only thing they had, and that wasn't enough to do them any help. And so again, it's really kind of this idea that these extremely wealthy individuals kind of surrounded themselves with all the resources in the world, only to find out that those resources meant absolutely nothing. Now, this is when we get into the idea, I guess, really a little bit of a follow-up with regards to Captain America. And the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, following his escape from Dimension Z, he was also joined with Jet Black, basically the daughter of Arnim Zola, who had been specifically engineered for the purpose of being somebody able to engage in combat. But what we also find out is that a deal was struck between Steve Rogers and Jet Black. The Jet Black was inevitably going to be brought in by S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, of course, she's currently being interrogated by Nick Fury Jr. And to sidetrack for a second, there was an interview that Tom Brevoort did, one of the I think the vice president of something over at Marvel. There was an interview that he did with I want to say it was Newsarama or something like that. And they were talking about the character of Nick Fury Jr., basically the black son of Nick Fury Sr., who's a white guy. And when the question was asked, how do you reconcile those two things? And why is that version of Nick Fury here? The answer was, well, we just need more African-American representation in comic books, which didn't really make a whole lot of sense because you basically had Samuel L. Jackson Nick Fury in the Ultimate Universe. Now, the logic could be drawn here that the Ultimate Universe was far less popular than the main Marvel Universe, in which case the question has to be asked, why not just bring that version of Nick Fury over? But the fact remains here, that's really the only reason why his character's here is because of the fact that there needed to be more African-American representation in Marvel, according to the Marvel brass themselves. So again, he doesn't really have any intrinsic value here. He's really just here for the sake of diversity, which is really kind of interesting. But the fact remains here that with Steve Rogers showing up and basically removing Jet Black from the equation, this is when we learn that the bargain that was struck between the two of them was the idea that Jet Black would not reveal any of the information about Ian, and Steve Rogers would basically help her cope with how to get past or how to live in a normal life in the main Marvel universe. And so what we end up finding out here is that Steve Rogers feels very out of time. He feels very displaced following the time he spent in Dimension Z raising Ian, only to basically realize that Ian was killed accidentally by Sharon Carter, and Sharon Carter herself presumably died in the events of Dimension Z. And so because of that, Steve Rogers basically feels like there's nothing here for him. Now, this is really kind of Rick Remender going back and co-opting a lot of the stuff that we saw when Captain America first showed up in the 1960s, or really first came back in Avengers #4. And the reason why is because of the fact that back in the 1950s, when Captain America was first brought back by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the stories of the time were designed to be upbeat. You would really never see anything like what we're seeing now back in their method of storytelling. Stan Lee, through various interviews, always stated that he liked to keep things upbeat, he liked to keep things happy, relatively cheerful. He didn't want comics to be somewhat of a downer, or in a lot of ways, a reflection of real life. The only real measure of reflection that came in Stan Lee's early writings was how people interacted with one another and how teenagers were depicted and different things like that. But with this particular bit of storytelling, Rick Remender is very much taking the opposite approach that, Steve Rogers feels very much like he did when he was thawed out during the events of Avengers #4, when he was saved by the Avengers themselves. But with Sharon Carter being gone, with his son basically being gone, there's no reason for him to be here. He feels like there's no purpose for him in this world. And so it's really kind of cool to see a man that's just struggling. And we never really see Captain America this this way. Captain America is always the confident guy. He's always the guy on the front lines, first in, last out. Because of that, it's always one of the most interesting scenarios to see him when he's so confident, when he's so strong, and then suddenly so emotional, effectively having a breakdown in front of Sam Wilson. And so again, what this does is it basically coincides with the character of Nuke. Now, Frank Simpson was one of the byproducts of the Weapon Plus event campaign that basically led to James Hallett becoming Wolverine and Wade Wilson becoming Deadpool. But the difference here is that Frank Simpson basically ingests pills that amp him up. They get him prepped and excited for war. The idea here, though, is that somebody is basically issuing him orders. Somebody's basically telling him, you need to go into these various territories that the United States has had wars in and finish those guys off. And because Frank Simpson is so gung-ho, because he's so extreme, this is exactly what he's doing. He's going around to different territories where the US had conflicts and essentially had to pull out because they more or less lost. He's going through and just killing everybody that he sees, spraying them all down with bullets and then planting American flags. And Frank Simpson's mind, as insane as he is, he's basically winning the war that America lost in that particular area. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because of the fact that the press has not gotten wind of what it is that's going on. But if the media finds out that a guy with an American flag tattoo on his face is running amok in countries where the United States had previously lost conflicts, killing everybody there and then planting American flags, it's going to create an international incident. And so because of that, S.H.I.E.L.D. basically sends in Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson highly under the radar and has them take out Frank Simpson. Now, this is kind of interesting because with the character of Nuke, in a lot of ways, he looks up to Captain America. And he's not the only one. We know the Punisher, for example, enlisted in the Vietnam War because he wanted to be Captain America. And this is really Rick Remender kind of pointing at the legacy that was made by Steve Rogers. Because he was such an iconic character, because in the eyes of a lot of people, he was America personified fighting against the Axis powers, the legacy that he created stands the test of time as one of the most significant legacies in the history of Marvel Comics. This also coincides with the idea that in the modern day, Captain America is the de facto leader of the Avengers. His word is almost universally accepted as law. You could have the entirety of the Avengers, you could have 100 members of the Avengers in a room arguing over what step they should take next in some campaign that's going on somewhere. Captain America will stand up, he will speak, everybody will stop, they will listen, and when he says, this is what we're doing, that's what will get done. And so it's really a cool thing to see his character depicted in this manner. And so to basically have, Frank Simpson saying, look, I'm trying to respect our boys, I'm trying to respect our guys in the military, I'm trying to win the war that they lost, I'm trying to make America great again, something along those lines. What it basically does is it leads to the idea that Frank Simpson is essentially beyond hope, beyond redemption, and is effectively insane. And that's the nature of his character. He's just a crazy guy. And so because of this, we end up having him subdued by Captain America and by Sam Wilson, and then taken by S.H.I.E.L.D. and placed in custody. But what we end up finding out here is that this has all been a part of the plan of Iron Nail. And the reason why is because of the fact that Shin has been giving, or he's the one that was giving Nuke all the information that he needed. He was the one that was sending Nuke on all these different campaigns and the one having him interact with all this stuff, knowing that S.H.I.E.L.D. was inevitably going to arrest him and was going to take him into custody. The reason why he did that is because an explosive had been planted inside of Nuke, and living up to his namesake, Shin detonates the explosive, effectively sending S.H.I.E.L.D. into a state of disarray, after which he initiates his second phase, which is to basically free Dr. Mindbubble, the guy who is responsible for launching the Weapons Minus program and the guy that has the ability to effectively ensnare people in little pockets of reality, if he so wishes, by trapping them inside one of his bubbles. It's really crazy. The events that are getting ready to go down are absolutely insane. But again, all this is going to lead into Steve Rogers losing his super soldier serum. All this is going to lead into him becoming an old man, setting the stage for Sam Wilson to become the new Captain America. So getting into the Iron Nail, the story when Steve Rogers loses the super soldier serum, this is super cool. Like, it's definitely one of my my favorite Captain America stories, because it just seems like a natural progression, right? I mean, we knew as the reader that like a time will come when Steve Rogers will just stop being Captain America. And it makes sense. I mean, after a while, you can only ever tell so many stories. There's only so many times when you can read about Steve Rogers running into the battlefield, Avengers assemble, freedom! Like, there's only so many times before it's like, okay, let's get something a little bit new. But the idea here was that when this initially dropped, it was very divisive in the community. People absolutely began to freak out. You know, Captain America purists lost their minds. They could not imagine anybody besides Steve Rogers playing the role of Captain America. They were just kind of trapped in that mindset. At the same time, you had people who wanted to see Captain America kind of just remain the hero that they always envisioned. They weren't really locked into the character, but for them, it's just Steve Rogers was always Captain America. And so it created kind of like one of those interesting scenarios. But for me, I always loved this. I always loved this story. I loved the idea of simply seeing somebody else carry the mantle, even if it was only going to be for a temporary amount of time, or even if it was permanent. I always thought it would be kind of cool. And in truth, I loved what Hickman did with Captain America in Avengers and New Avengers, where he's just like this old man, cynical and angry at the world, and just like running S.H.I.E.L.D., trying to get revenge on the Illuminati. It was kind of cool. It was really an interesting concept. But again, what we also get is this depiction of what it is that Dr. Mindbubble does, in the sense that, remember, in the last video, we talked about how Nuke was just this crazy military guy. He was basically trying to win wars that had long since been over. And so he was going into international territories or going into other countries, into sovereign states, shooting their people up, planting American flags, and it threatened to create an international incident. And so the result was that he was basically captured by Captain America and Sam Wilson as Falcon, and then kept prisoner on a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, only for us to find out that he was being used by the Iron Nail. A bomb was put inside of him, and he was detonated, resulting in the deaths of some 160 some odd, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, the destruction of the helicarrier, and Nuke himself. And so again, what Dr. Mindbubble does, or at least what this little tidbit does, is it basically picks up with Frank Simpson having single-handedly won the war. And that's really what his dream is, and that's how Dr. Mindbubble works. He has the ability to manipulate reality around individuals, but only insofar that he traps their minds inside of a reality bubble. So he's not like Franklin Richards or like Molecule Man or anything like that. He can't inherently alter reality itself. He simply just kind of creates an illusion inside the mind of the people who were trapped in his bubbles, and then they believe it to be an absolute truth. And so because of this, this is really just designed by Mindbubble to essentially allow Frank Simpson to experience the passing over process without really suffering or struggling. Now, in truth, I mean, the guy's got a giant hole in his chest, so I guess it kind of works. But the fact remains here that we also have Mindbubble encountering Rand Shin. Now, keep in mind, Rand Shin, the Iron Nail, had been the hidden hand behind all of this. He had been on this campaign to take down S.H.I.E.L.D. for years and years and years and years. And again, a lot of this is rooted in the fact that he felt betrayed by S.H.I.E.L.D. in the sense that he was an agent at one point along the line. He was assigned to infiltrate communist China. He eventually became this kind of corrupted guy by having the Shaolin Scientist Squad, Shaolin Scientist Squad, there we go, was ultimately, kind of ousted by Mao himself, and then eventually recaptured by S.H.I.E.L.D. again. And so because of that, he'd essentially lost his mind. He'd kind of gone drunk with power. And so the result was that he's basically waging a war against S.H.I.E.L.D. and trying to bring down S.H.I.E.L.D. in its entirety. Now, in truth, this is kind of a reflection of the larger picture. S.H.I.E.L.D. is only one facet. For Rand Shin, it's really more of taking down the establishment, taking down all these various individuals. And we see this play out when we end up having, Captain America and Jet Black, again, the kind of, dimensional displaced daughter of Arnim Zola, walking side by side. Now, the cool thing about this is keep in mind, Rick Remender is not teasing any sort of romance here. I mean, he's not really saying, well, Jet Black and Steve Rogers, they might become something. It's not really going to work that way. In truth, Jet Black is battle-hardened. She views the world wildly different than Steve Rogers does. She's ruthless. She's like, look, there are two types of people in this world. There's criminals and there's people who are not criminals. Criminals should die, and that's the end of that. She's very Punisher-like in terms of how she functions and in terms of what she does, whereas Captain America is a lot more lenient. Everyone deserves a second chance and that kind of a thing. And so the reason why this sort of moral quandary plays out is because they basically end up, as they're walking along, they end up running into a guy who's effectively one of these, big shot Wall Street bankers, who's just kind of pissed off because they're not giving out enough bad loans and not making him enough money and so on and so forth. But the Shaolin Scientist Squad intervenes with the intention of whisking this guy away. And that's what Rand Shin's been doing. He's been sending his scientist squad out into the world and then capturing those individuals who prey on others. Now, it's not just bankers, it's, like the wealthy elite, different things like that. And that's the war that he's been waging. And that's really kind of the moral quandary that's being asked here, like with Wall Street bankers and different things like that. Who's really at fault here? The person who issued the loan or the person who signed their name on the dotted line of the loan they knew they couldn't afford? That's why it creates kind of a funny scenario. And there's only really so much you can do. If like after the mortgage crisis in 2008, an army, or vigilantes had walked into Wall Street and started carrying off all these Wall Street bankers, people probably wouldn't have batted an eye. They probably would have said, yeah, man, they deserve it. But then if they said, okay, phase 2 is now to also take away those people who signed their names on the dotted lines of homes they couldn't afford, well, then suddenly people would start freaking out and there would be excuses galore. Well, I didn't know, all that kind of good stuff. And so because of that, it creates kind of this interesting scenario. The fact remains here that this is tried and true Steve Rogers. At the end of the day, despite the fact that this guy is effectively a corporate criminal, despite the fact that this guy is doing some pretty heinous things. He hasn't broken any literal laws yet. He hasn't actually broken a particular law. Instead, he's just a really shady Wall Street guy. And so Captain America is beholden to the law and the law only. And that's the way his character always functioned, is the sense that he always went against individuals who violated the law. Captain America was beholden to the law itself. He wasn't beholden to a government. He wasn't beholden to the average person. He was beholden to the law and to freedom. If laws began to encroach on freedom, then he would in turn battle against those laws and battle on the side of freedom. And so because of those things, he was very much a patriotic character. He was very much a guy that was a reflection of average and normal society. The funny thing about this is that we end up having the Sharon scientist squad basically just kind of like whisk away, you know, more or less teleport when the battle is over. And Steve Rogers is really just kind of left to allow this guy to be taken by the cops, you know, to be taken for treatment and so on and so forth. And so again, Steve Rogers himself is really facing this moral quandary because he looks around and says, look, man, you're a shady banker guy. Like, the world would legitimately be better off without you. If you just vanished, you know, if these guys had taken you away and you were working in some cave, the world would not mourn you. The world would not miss you. There's nothing in your life of any significance. And so we'd be fine without you, you know, but at the end of the day, he is beholden to the law. He's beholden to freedom. He's beholden to the idea that people who commit crimes or do bad things should be held accountable for that within the confines of the law. And that's really kind of the nature, that's the knife's edge that Captain America walks. Because all it would ever really take, and this is an argument that he's made time and time again, this is an argument that's been made in Marvel Comics time and time again, especially during the first Civil War. All it takes is making it acceptable one time. All it takes is for someone to come along and say, yeah, that person did something bad. But the problem is, if there was a trial, they would probably get away with it. Let's just nix the trial and just take them out in a public square and shoot them. Let's just do that, because then we don't have to worry about it. And sure, it would be more efficient. Executing people for their crimes, statistically speaking, does not prevent people from committing crimes. It's not a deterrent, but it does prevent repeat offenders. A person can't commit a crime again if they're dead. And so because of that, it'd be so much easier, and it would certainly smooth the process out if people were just executed on the spot for the crimes that they commit. But if you do that once, then you can do it twice. And if you can do it twice, you can do it 3 times, and then 4 times, and 5 times, and suddenly it becomes the societal standard. Structure, organization, society itself breaks down on a fundamental level, and it's nothing but the Wild West. It's just a bunch of crazy people running around with guns, shooting each other up because one guy has something another guy wants. And so because of that, in order to maintain structure, in order to maintain order, rules have to be imposed. Right, wrong, or otherwise, they are there. And Captain America fights on behalf of those so long as they do not encroach on people's freedom. And so again, it makes a really cool scenario when it comes to his character, how he functions, and how he exists. And so what we end up finding out here is that in the aftermath of the destruction of this helicarrier, we essentially have, you know, Steve Rogers basically showing up at the behest of Maria Hill, and she of course informs him that Weapons Minus is basically free, and that Weapon Minus, again, basically Dr. Mind Bubble, was created to be a deterrent for Steve Rogers, for Wolverine, for all those different guys. It was S.H.I.E.L.D.'s answer to Weapon Plus. And so because of that, Jet also uses her Omni senses, her ability to push any one of her senses to the infinite peak, and simply, you know, use her sight to realize that, you know, Sam Wilson's still alive, which of course they end up rescuing him. But again, the role of Dr. Mind Bubble begins to come into play when we have Nick Fury Jr., who has been taken by Mind Bubble. And while he sees inside this illusion that he's basically tracking down Hydra, that Hydra's trying to access something called the gun gear, ultimately, this is really just Mind Bubble using Nick Fury to activate the machinery itself. Now, we'll actually find out what that is, and it's really, really cool. But this is when we basically get this whole exposition on what it is that Dr. Mind Bubble is about. Of course, we have Captain America and we have Falcon trying to track down Nick Fury, as well as Mind Bubble and so on. But we end up finding out from, at least from what they're told by Maria Hill, that initially, when Weapons Plus was first launched with Weapon Zero, with Captain America Steve Rogers and Project Rebirth, and when the Weapons Plus project was turned into Weapon 1 and Weapon 2 and Weapon 3, going all the way up to Weapons 10 or Weapons X with Wolverine, and then eventually going into Deadpool and then so on and so forth, that S.H.I.E.L.D. realized that if super soldiers were being cranked out in this kind of variation and in these extremes, S.H.I.E.L.D. would need a countermeasure. The problem with this was that this guy, Horace Littleton, the one who was leading the project, could not find any legit volunteers after he had basically taken LSD and merged it with the super soldier serum. Now, the answer is not given to us in terms of how he was able to locate the super soldier serum, because keep in mind, that's the whole core of Captain America. Dr. Abraham Erskine formed the super soldier serum. The super soldier serum was originally intended to be a deterrent against the expansion of mutants in the Marvel Universe. The result is that, you know, following the creation of Captain America, Abraham Erskine was killed by the Germans, and the secret of the super soldier serum was lost with him. Weapons, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, going all the way up to Wolverine and Deadpool, those were all basically attempts to either duplicate the super soldier serum or create something wholly different. And so because of that, we don't know how, you know, it is that Horace Littleton got the super soldier soldier serum, if it's even the legit serum itself. It could just be a spinoff. Because there were no volunteers, he basically used it on himself. And what it did is it gave him the ability to create these mind-altering bubbles that are composed of literal LSD and supersoldier serum, and then impose those bubbles on other people, forcing them to see whatever it is that's inside there. Now again, Horace Littleton does not control what people see inside that bubble. The bubbles are basically just emitted from his mind and sort of thrown out there, and that's really about it. I mean, the structure is created by him, the environment is created by him, but in terms of how people experience things, in terms of those individuals who talk to them, Horace does not have control of that. You know, in the case of Nick Fury, for example, it's just, here is a dream where Nick Fury is helping to track down Hydra and helping to defeat Hydra. And then whatever goes on inside that dream is basically up to Nick Fury himself in terms of how his mind construes it. But the fact remains here that with Horace Littleton behind the wheel and with Iron Nail continuing to control everything behind the scenes, this ultimately leads to a direct conflict between these two SHIELD helicarriers. They literally just crash into one another. Now, of course, Captain America is doing what he can to face off against these various guys, try to bring this helicarrier down in its entirety. But the fact remains that with these two SHIELD helicarriers being forced to crash, with all of this happening under the control of Mind Bubble himself, it inevitably leads to a conflict directly between Captain America and Iron Nail. Now, this is effectively when Captain America begins to lose the super soldier serum. And the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, Rand Shen basically has the ability to emit these tendrils that will absorb energies out of people. It'll basically absorb what it is that makes them who they are, their life force or something along those lines. But even then, it's not explicitly explained. It's really more of like a plot device than anything else. We don't know, for example, if Iron Nail would be able to attack Kitty Pryde and then like absorb her X gene. We don't know if he would be able to do things like that. He probably wouldn't. The only indication we have of what he can do is when he basically absorbed the Infinity Formula, the formula that made Nick Fury and Dum Dum Dugan young, when he absorbed that serum out of them, and then Nick Fury and Dum Dum Dugan grew really old really fast. That's the only indication of what it is that he can do. And even Captain America makes that comment. He doesn't know what Iron Nail can do. All he knows is that Iron Nail is dangerous and somebody that needs to be dealt with. Now, this is kind of Rick Remender playing on the nature of Captain America, right? I mean, Captain America isn't the sharpest tool in the shed. I mean, he's smart, but he's really more of like, let's form a plan, somebody else give me the intelligence that I need, and then when I have that intelligence, then we'll form a plan on what it is that we should do. I mean, it's very indicative of what you would expect from a leader. A leader doesn't have to know everything. A leader just needs to be able to surround himself with effective people who know their information, so that way he can play the role of consolidating all that information, bringing it together, and making it a cohesive plan. That's why Captain America was always a leader of the Avengers, but that's why people like Iron Man were so essential, because they always had an intrinsic role to play. You had Tony Stark, you had Hank Pym, you know, some of the smartest people. You always had a brain guy as part of the Avengers so that you would have that intelligence aspect, and Captain America could use that in order to form his own plans. And so again, in the midst of this conflict, it's exactly as we would expect. Mind Bubble arrives and traps Captain America inside one of these bubbles. And this is when we basically learn the heart's desire of Steve Rogers, what it is that he wants above all else. He is surrounded by friends. He does have Jet Black, he does have Nick Fury, you know, Bucky Barnes is there. It's really this idea of, hey man, you made it out alive and you saved all of us. You know, it's so great that you pulled this off. The world is celebrating what it is that you've done. There's parades, all that kind of good stuff. But it's also the arrival, or I guess the fact that Ian is still alive, his son, who's, you know, basically dead, as well as Sharon Carter, who's still alive, who's effectively been discovered. And so because of that, this is really kind of like the perfect life of Steve Rogers. The parade is a reflection of what we would have expected to see, because had Captain America not been frozen during World War II, when the conflict was over, this is what he would have seen at home. He would have seen parades, streamers, celebration, all that kind of good stuff. He would have seen all of that. At the same time, with regards to Sharon Carter and Ian, it's basically him having a family. He's a husband and he's a father. And so because of that, his life is basically complete. He saved the superhero community and he's got a family of his own. This is really what it is that he wants the most, but in the end, he can't bring himself to accept it because in his mind, it's too perfect. Now, this is kind of interesting because with Captain America, we always kind of looked at him. We always kind of looked at Steve Rogers and said, okay, this is a guy who is a reflection of an archaic time. This is a guy who is a reflection of an age when things were a little more pure, you know, naive perhaps, but it's not a reflection of the modern day. It's just not how things are. People don't talk to each other the way that they used to. They don't, you know, engage in the kind of things the way they used to. And there's all different kinds of arguments you can extrapolate for that. But the fact remains here that with Steve Rogers himself looking out on this this and saying there's no possible way that I could be living in a world this perfect. The world doesn't exist this way anymore. They don't do parades when wars are won. You know, they don't do things like that. If this is the world, then this is not the real world. This is not my world. To have my wife or have my future wife back, to have my son back, to have saved all the superheroes, it doesn't work that way. The mission's over, we get debriefed, and then we get briefed on the next mission. That's just how it functions. That's just how it goes. There's a million reasons for why this world can't be real. And so, of course, Steve Rogers does the only thing you can do when it comes to escaping a mind bubble. He basically commits suicide, and that indeed is the only way to get out of a mind bubble. When you're trapped in one, you basically have to kill yourself. But this is why it's so dangerous, is because if the world around you shifts and you believe it's legitimately real, and you don't have the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's false, then it's like putting a gun in the hand of a schizophrenic. Is the world that they're living in with the gun real, or is the world without the gun real? Which one is true and which one is false? And so that's the crazy situation, is because if you weren't able to tell the difference, you could be standing in the real world out of the effects of a mind bubble, and people are telling you, no, do not pull that trigger. You're in the real world. But to you, you're not in the real world. You're in the mind bubble. The gun goes to the side of your head, the trigger gets pulled, and you are dead. That's it. There's no coming back. And so because that's what makes Dr. Mind Bubble so dangerous, is because the shift between real and false could take place, and you would just never know. The fact remains here that with Steve Rogers escaping, this leads directly into a conflict between himself and Iron Nail. Yet again, this battle between the two of them. Now, of course, Mind Bubble is more or less, incapacitated when Steve Rogers throws his shield at Mind Bubble's head, blocks the access port where the bubbles come out from, and the result is that his mind just starts filling up with all of his own dreams, and he really kind of goes crazy, and that's the end of that. But we also end up finding out that this gun gear, this device that they've basically accessed, is a Gundam. It's a giant Gundam. No, it's actually just a giant machine, really just kind of like a giant robot, which I guess it is a Gundam, but it's a weapon that S.H.I.E.L.D. had created. It's a weapon S.H.I.E.L.D. had created for the purpose of deterring and battling against a massive threat. Now, it's not being used for the purpose of incapacitating the Hulk, because truth be told, depending on how strong this machinery is, despite how big it is, the Hulk could probably still tear it apart. So it doesn't really matter on that kind of scale. The idea is that it's really just another weapon created by S.H.I.E.L.D. And so the result is that where, this is basically being accessed by Iron Nail, and it's going to be used for the intention of just kind of obliterating, society as a whole, and then sort of restructuring everything under Iron Nail himself. The battle between Captain America and Ran Shin ultimately leads to Steve Rogers, having to go to the Central Access Core, throwing a shield, basically destroying the core, thereby destroying the robot. And in the process, while he is able to get his shield off, he's impaled by these tendrils, which begin draining out the supersoldier serum from his body. And the result is that once it's all said and done, Ran Shin is effectively defeated, and then we basically have old man Steve Rogers. He's now lost his supersoldier serum, and that's effectively the end of him. And so what this does is it sets the stage for a story called The Tomorrow Soldier, which will begin the process of bringing in Sam Wilson as the new Captain America in all new, all different Captain America. Okay, RobCore, I'm in a weird situation and Benny wouldn't help me out. Well, he would, but he wouldn't. It's one of those funny things. I do not have a distinct branding unto my name outside of, with regards to like stories and stuff. I explain things, explaining stuff. So like the Infinity Gauntlet glove, explained. The Cosmic Cube, explained. Like I have those kind of things explained, but those are limited to like concepts, Now this, being stupid enough to fire the entire staff of SourceFed and thinking their channel would succeed, explained. Like, I have those things, for my channel, but those are ideas, those are concepts. They are not like stories. And so what I need is a branding for stories. So I hit up Benny and I was like, hey man, you have the complete story. I need something that's identifiably my own. And it doesn't seem like I'm bootlegging, complete story. He's like, okay, like I'll help you try to figure this out. And then he never did. He went rock climbing. So I was like, okay, you know what? If that's how you're going to be, then you be that way. I will consult the RobCore. I will hit up you guys and we will try to come together with a name. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to think of a name series, I guess a name branding for whenever it is that I do stories. So it'll be like all new, all different Marvel, the rundown, DC Rebirth, the rundown, whatever it is or something like that, but we'll figure it out, But regardless, we pick up now with Captain America, the Tomorrow Soldier. Now, for those of you guys who are just now joining Comics Explain, if this is your first video, I promise I never start my videos off that crazy. Sometimes I do, but I usually try not to. But this is basically Captain America before the events of all new, all different Marvel. Essentially Captain America before he became a Hydra agent. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because of the fact that, to me, this is very, very important. This is a very important aspect of his character, in the sense that this gives us an idea of what Captain America was about before he became a Hydra agent. And so because of that, we basically covered Dimension Z, and then we covered all the stories after that led us up to here right now. And so with this in mind, this is officially when, one, Sharon Carter becomes an old woman, and two, Sam Wilson becomes Captain America. And these are two of the two really, really important things. But again, the whole idea of Arnim Zola running Dimension Z and having his own little world unto himself was really a plot point that had kind of been left hanging for a couple of stories, simply being because of the fact that Rick Remender was coming back to it. We basically got Captain America stuck in Dimension Z, in the dimension of Arnim Zola. He basically raised his son, he escaped, and the result was that Arnim Zola kind of sat in the background, and now he's coming back into the fray again. And this really just comes by way of an interdimensional invasion. Now, of course, the other half of this is we have, this massive soldier of sorts that's essentially an assassin trying to track down Steve Rogers on his own. Now, with regards to Captain America himself, with regards to Steve Rogers himself, he's in a very weird quandary, because remember, he's not used to being in a position where he's so vulnerable. Captain America is used to being in a position where he's in control, where he knows everything that's going on, and if he doesn't, he's surrounded by those who do. In a lot of ways, he is here. We've got Nick Fury Jr., we've got Maria Hill, we've got people who are basically surrounding him, and he has the kind of resources that he needs. But at the same time, he's basically kind of stuck here in the sense that he's an old man. He lost his super soldier serum in the last video. And so because of that, he is not quite the Captain America Steve Rogers that we're used to, and in a lot of ways is kind of stuck on the back burner. Now, the other half of this is that apparently Sam Wilson and Jet Black, the daughter of Arnim Zola, got together. And this is kind of funny because Sam Wilson wakes up and starts panicking, and he's like, no, this is workplace involvement. This is not a good idea. We're not supposed to be doing this. Now, again, this is kind of cool because in a lot of ways, Sam Wilson showed a lot of traits of Steve Rogers himself. Now, it doesn't mean that Sam Wilson was designed to be a clone, not by any standard of measurement. When Marvel first introduced Sam Wilson, he was his own character. He had his own moral compass, his own belief system, but they followed almost exactly in line with what Captain America stood for. In terms of superheroes and sidekicks running into the modern era, they were really the last bit. It was the last fig leaf, so to speak, in the sense that there were no more superheroes as sidekicks by the time we got around to this era, but we maintained Captain America. We maintained Sam Wilson. These are things that really seem to work well for their character. They were kind of like the 1-2 punch of the Avengers leadership role. And so because of this, we ultimately end up finding out that with Arnim Zola, basically invading the planet Earth, that Tony Stark and a handful of others have also done a litany of investigations and research onto Steve Rogers, and there's no trace of the super soldier serum inside of his body. Now, this is actually really kind of cool, and this makes sense because this is basically Rick Remender saying there's no possibility of Captain America Steve Rogers becoming a super soldier again by way of the super soldier serum. Now, right now, in All New, All Different Marvel, for those of you guys who are reading that, yes, he is young. Yes, he is a super soldier. He's got super strength and all that kind of good stuff. That is because of the fact that the cosmic cube was used to alter him. He was not re-injected with a super soldier serum. He did not undergo Project Rebirth again. It's just reality warping. And so we kind of have to believe that once this all comes to an end, once the whole idea of a secret empire event basically closes out, that Steve Rogers will likely go back to being old again. Now, I'm sure he'll just be a really old, grumpy man, but still, he'll go back to being old again. Now, the other half of this is that he is not entirely defenseless. He's got a cane, and sure, you can put on a show of looking like he doesn't necessarily know everything that's going on, but he's still pretty capable of defending himself. The issue here is that we have this lone assassin who shows up from Dimension Z breaking into the building. Now, this is cool because it's almost like Bruce Lee's Game of Death, right? He just starts going through the tower, fighting different martial artists, fighting different styles of martial arts, ultimately leading him up to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who for whatever reason people thought would be a legit martial artist, and the result is that it kind of turns into this weird, awkward fight. But the fact remains here that this assassin rising up and facing off against this core group of the Avengers is really just kind of him going against Thor, going against Iron Man, and going against the Incredible Hulk. But each time he's able to outmaneuver them and outfight them. Now, the beauty of this is that it is a direct reflection of how to overcome these individual guys. And the way this works is just by the idea of why would you stand in the way of Thor's hammer if you can just jump over it? At the end of the day, sure, only the worthy can pick it up, but still, it's an inanimate object. He might as well be throwing a cup or throwing a rock. All you have to do is just dodge out of the way.
If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball.
What?
Mjolnir!
With the Incredible Hulk, it's the exact same way. He's extremely strong, and he would beat the absolute crap out of this guy if he could get his hands on him. And so what this shows us is that this assassin is wildly capable in terms of what it is that he can do. And as he goes toe to toe with each and every one of these guys, ultimately he catches up to Steve Rogers, and Steve Rogers is actually the guy who incapacitates him. And that's a cool thing, because it's basically Rick Remender saying, hey, look guys, yes, Steve Rogers is an old man, yes, he's grizzled, yes, he takes naps, but the idea here is that he's still very much able to defend himself. He's still very much able to engage in combat with different people. And so it's still kind of cool to see that despite the fact that he's old, he's not entirely helpless. But ultimately, we actually end up finding out that this guy is his son, Ian. Ian has survived his entire experience in Dimension Z. Now, the way that Rick Remender does this is really kind of messing with us. I mean, that's one of the things that Remender did in a lot of different ways. He would play on comic book tropes. And one of the things that he does here is he basically says, oh, well, where we thought Ian was dead, he actually fell into a huge vat of this biomaterial that was used to create him in the first place, which basically just healed his wounds and then spit him back out again. So it's like, okay, whatever, man, I guess it works. The reason why I'm on board with that, the reason why I'm perfectly fine with it is because Remender does not do that consistently. He's not one of those writers who always just kind of invokes these MacGuffins all the time, and it's just like, hey, I wrote myself into a hole, time for a plot device. He doesn't really do that all the time. He's really good at building character, really, really good at telling stories. And so as comic book readers, we usually just kind of give him a pass. We're like, yeah, man, it's cool, don't worry about it, don't do it again, but don't worry about it. And we don't really mind too much. But the fact remains here that with regards to Sam Wilson himself, this is when he begins to display the attributes of what it is that makes a person qualified to be Captain America. Alongside Jet Black, they basically delve headlong into the base of Arnim Zola. And the reason why is because of the fact that within this base are essentially the breeding pens, the pens that Arnim Zola uses to make these massive numbers of soldiers and so on and so forth. Now, he's also kind of made his own grotesque, kind of disfigured version of the Avengers in the form of these different monsters. And while Sam Wilson and Jet Black are able to overcome these guys, once they get to the actual pens themselves, we end up finding out that within one of the prison cells is Sharon Carter. Now, this is the reason why Sharon has grown so old. For those of you guys who are reading All New, All Different Marvel right now, because I saw this question a few times in some of the videos that I posted, and I figured we go ahead and do this just for the sake of answering it. But one of the questions people had is, how did Sharon Carter get old? Why is she an older woman now, when previously, before All New, All Different Marvel, she was a woman that couldn't be but in her 20s, maybe early 30s? Well, the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, in Dimension Z, time passes faster. And so while Captain America, Steve Rogers, was only in Dimension Z for 30 minutes, to his mind, he was there for 12 years. With Sharon Carter, it's the same way. She was there for a little bit longer, save maybe a few hours or so, maybe even a day. But for her, years passed, something close to maybe like 20 years. Now, what this is designed to do, or at least what it seems like Rick Remender intended to do, was kind of fast track the age of Sharon Carter so then he could turn around and pair Sharon Carter and Steve Rogers back up together again. And the reason why is because of the fact that if Sharon Carter was basically out of the equation at the time that Steve Rogers lost his supersoldier serum, and then suddenly he ages to like 80 years old or something like that, well, then he couldn't date Sharon Carter, who's 30. Like a 50-year age gap would just be weird. And so because of that, by basically throwing her in Dimension Z, keeping there for some measure of time, he can bring her back out, and then suddenly she's 60 or 65 or maybe even 70, something along those lines. She looks like she's kind of I don't know, maybe her 40s or 50s, but nonetheless, he can basically, age her to the point that it's reasonable that her and Steve Rogers would still have some measure of attraction, and they could still share some measure of a life together. And so with her being brought back here, again, it's very shocking for Sam Wilson, because remember, when it was presumed that she died, Steve Rogers' life just came crashing down. I mean, he was just like, there's no reason for me to be here anymore. I had a son for 12 years, now he's gone. Sharon Carter, the love of my life, she's gone. I don't know what to do being a superhero anymore. The community's fractured. Avengers are fighting Avengers are fighting X-Men, and the incursions are happening. So remember, this takes place during the events of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. So the incursions are still happening at the time this story is being written. Earths are still crashing into each other. So it's really kind of cool to see this whole scenario take place. But the fact remains here, with regards to Arnim Zola himself, things end with him, quick, fast, and in a hurry. Rick Remender really does not waste a lot of time with Zola himself. This all really just kind of descends down into a fight between, Arnim Zola and the Avengers, and then eventually, Arnim Zola and Sam Wilson, and that's really about it. Now, at the time that this is happening, what ends up happening here, or at least what we end up finding out, is that Arnim Zola having all these different forces go against the Avengers are a distraction. The real goal of Arnim Zola is to basically have these soldiers fight the Avengers and then use the machinery of his antenna to telepathically communicate with his soldiers to steadily begin to fall back, not to just run back to the building, but to kind of take a step back and fight and then a step back and fight. And what that will do is it'll slowly lead in the Avengers. And the reason why is because within this major facility is a bomb that will wipe out the entirety of the city and anybody in its immediate vicinity. Ideally, it'll destroy the Avengers. And so with 30 seconds left, with this bomb being known about, the antenna's ripped off and it initiates a 30-second failsafe, which leads, of course, to Sam Wilson grabbing the bomb and then racing off into space, after which the bomb explodes. Now, with this conflict more or less over, Arnim Zola manages to sort of sway his daughter Jet Black back to his side by essentially saying, hey, look, you know, in the moment when the superheroes could have used you the most, they kind of cast you aside to a degree. You and Sam Wilson kind of shared a love for one another, but he basically sacrificed his life in order to save the superhero community. You had feelings for Captain America, but as soon as Sharon Carter comes back, he kicks you to the side. It's really just kind of preying on the fact that she's very unsure of herself, that she's in a very confused state because she's not from the main Marvel universe, she's from Dimension Z. And so by kind of preying on these different aspects that were kind of preying on her as a whole, basically saying things like, I genuinely need you, you're my only daughter, someone has to lead my forces, you're the only one capable of doing it, you're the only real warrior that I know. Ultimately, this leads to her kind of swaying back to his side. Now, at the same time, of course, we actually end up finding out that Sam Wilson survived the experience. Now, we don't know how, and we're not really told how. We're just kind of told that he survived the explosion, presumably because of the fact that he just kind of flew into space, pushed the bomb out of the way, and then just sort of crashed back down. And we don't really need a great big huge grandiose explanation. Now, in truth, I would imagine that half of this is because of the traditional style of Rick Remender in terms of how he tells stories, in the sense that he basically leaves a lot of the mortar between the bricks, kind of leaves it to us to figure out, but also because of the fact that Marvel probably pushed the initiative for Sam Wilson to become Captain America. And so when editorial is basically telling you Steve Rogers needs to leave, you can only really show so much interest in that before your story kind of reflects a slight irritation. Now, I may be putting words in the mouth of Rick Remender. It may very well be that he was the one that made the call. I haven't been able to find any interviews where he basically said, I'm the one that came up with it, although those may very well exist out there. But the fact remains here that with Jet Black going to meet with the Avengers, despite the fact that she was able to sort of stay away at least a little bit from her father's side, with Steve Rogers basically saying, look, we're gonna have to get all of this figured out, with your father and the whole 9 yards. We need you to surrender your weapon so that we can investigate what's going on and do a little more research. This results in her basically saying, you guys still don't, after everything she's done, you guys still don't trust me. And so that's really the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a lack of trust. And in truth, she's actually right about that. I mean, she fought alongside Sam Wilson. She fought alongside the Avengers. She put her trust and confidence in Captain America. He put his trust in hers. But in the moment of truth, when the question came down, am I with them or am I against them? They basically said, well, how you feel is irrelevant. We do not view you as an Avenger. And so with that in mind, she basically just walks away. She just completely takes off, bails out, and rejoins her father. Now, of course, what this does is transition to about a week later. Now, this is where things get a little murky in the realm of Marvel Comics. And the reason why is because of the fact that this story came out in October of 2014, but in June of 2014, Original Sin number 3 came out. Now, the reason why I say that's important is because of the fact that in the Original Sin story, it basically dealt with the idea that everything the Watcher had ever seen had kind of been broadcast out to the world. And it was a way for Marvel to just kind of write these little stories, introduce these little retcons and things like that for characters that nobody ever knew about before. With regards to Steve Rogers, he had basically learned that when the incursions first started happening and the Illuminati of, Doctor Strange and Black Bolt of the Inhumans and, Tony Stark and all these different guys, that they had basically wiped his mind, and removed his knowledge of the fact that they were going to leave and start traveling around and destroying worlds. He saw that in Original Sin number 3. And so at the time this story takes place, Steve Rogers knows he was betrayed by the Illuminati. At the time this story takes place, chronologically, Steve Rogers should not be allied with Tony Stark. He should not be allied with Doctor Strange. He shouldn't be allied with these guys. He should be hunting them down and tracking them down. And so again, this creates a little bit of a continuity error, nothing wildly significant. There are stories that crop up from time to time that kind of contradict everything that's going on. But in truth, we can really just kind of ignore that. We can really just kind of say, well, I mean, that's how it goes, whatever, and then just sort of read the rest of the story for what it is. But essentially what happens is Captain America calls together everyone who has ever been an Avenger, and essentially says, look, I've led this team for years and years and years and years. But the issue here is that I am now an old man. I've lost the supersoldier serum. I cannot fight out on the battlefield. And so because of this, he basically steps back and says, I can no longer be Captain America. Instead, somebody needs to take my place. And that person is going to be Sam Wilson, who officially becomes Captain America for the very first first time. Now, the reason why this was so debated among fans is because in their mind, and a lot of forum posts and a lot of different things, I saw it on Twitter the whole time, the idea was just because Steve Rogers can't fight doesn't mean that he can't be Captain America. Captain America is as much of a leader as he is a soldier. Keep the Captain America costume and just be in the background, dishing out orders, monitoring everything from the background. That's exactly what he does in the early days of Sam Wilson. He just kind of sits in the back and guides Sam Wilson in terms of what it means to become Captain America. That was really one of the solutions that a lot of fans came up with. Just because he can't fight doesn't mean he can't be Captain America. But again, a lot of those were really Steve Rogers purists. They didn't want to see anybody else but Steve Rogers play Captain America, which is fine. I mean, I feel the exact same way when it comes down to a lot of the characters that I know and love. You know, I don't want to see anybody be the Sentry but Robert Reynolds. You know, I don't want to see anybody leading the X-Men but Charles Xavier. I don't want to see anybody undertake the role of Magneto except for Magneto himself. I'm kind of like that, you know, when it comes to different characters and teams. And so again, it's just really kind of one of those staples. But what this story does is it basically dead ends and goes directly into all new, all different Marvel. We can literally just ignore Last Days and all that stuff. We can stop here and go into all new, all different Marvel. And so again, it's sort of interesting in terms of how it all comes together. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. Do not forget, the Secret Empire playlist will be down in the description. That will have everything you need going up to really Captain America Sam Wilson and Captain America Steve Rogers. We will add to that. We will add stuff like the Avengers. We will add Avengers Standoff. We will add a lot of stories that kind of lead up into Secret Empire. Civil War II will be in that playlist. Inhumans versus X-Men will be in that playlist. We'll do a lot of things that will lead up to that story and give us a lot of interesting information. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.